Well, good evening, this is Hound Dog Steve. I hope you've been having a great week, and it is a pleasure to see you here this evening. And tonight we're going to revisit Boris Johnson. This is a very, very interesting situation coming up. Boris Johnson has basically inherited a virtually non-functioning majority. He's holding on to a majority by 2 from the Democratic Union over in Ireland there, and that is looking very shaky as there are 2 by-elections coming up, and if they lose one or both, that will be the majority gone. Now, although Boris Johnson has said that he is not going to call a snap election before the Brexit date of October 31st, he's a mercurial kind of character, and you can expect anything from him. He does tend to fly by the seat of his pants, and really, you know, if he's going to call a snap election, now is the time to do it. His own party is in disarray. He has about 15 or 20 Remainers still on the backbenches, and they are causing a rift within the party. But an election would unify the situation. It would certainly get everybody on the same side, hopefully. I don't know what would happen with the Brexit party. Nigel Farage could be a wild card, because if he were to run for government and Prime Minister under the Brexit party flag, that could definitely split the Conservative vote. Now, he did say, Nigel Farage that is, he did say that if he felt, he would only run if he felt that Brexit was not going to be delivered by the Conservative government. But aside from that, this would be actually quite good timing. Jeremy Corbyn is in absolute disarray. He has got defectors all over the place. He has bled out about 64 of his MPs, some of whom have formed the Independent Party, so that is a complete fracture. There is a lot of dissent with those remaining in the party. About 25% are leavers, they're Brexiteers, they want to leave the EU, and a fully 66% of the rest of the MPs are in ridings that voted to leave. And so they're going to be in a very sticky situation. I mean, they're almost going to be forced to vote to leave or get ousted in the next election by the public. So there is a possibility of that happening. It certainly would be, the timing would be good. If you're going to do it now. The other big problem that the Liberals are having is that Jeremy Corbyn has really been flip-flopping on the Brexit issue. First of all, voting to leave, and now seems to be holding a somewhat inflexible position of another referendum to ask again whether Britons want to stay in the EU or to leave. So, and the other thing that's going on with Corbyn is the anti-Semitism. He's taken on a very strong pro-Palestinian stance, and he has been filmed with Hamas, which have been labelled a terrorist group. So that is another rocky issue, because again, in fact, there was a number of MPs took out an ad saying that they accept all religions except Jews, to really highlight that Jeremy Corbyn had this very, very anti-Semitic streak within him, and this will again divide the party. And going into election, this is not a good situation for Corbyn. As it says in the Bible, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Now, of course, another issue that Boris Johnson will have to address is the Irish backstop, and this is probably the thorniest issue of all, because of the Southern Ireland border, which has become pretty much porous in the days since the Northern Ireland joined the EU, and of course the border with England has been porous. Well, when England leaves the EU, that border, what do you do with that border? Now, I certainly think that the south-north border should remain porous, but again, the British Northern Ireland border crossing would be problematic, and I'm not really sure how that is going to be resolved, other than, as I said, you just leave under World Trade Organization rules, and you figure it out as you go along. At the end of the day, every buyer is looking for a seller, and every seller is looking for a buyer. So I'm sure that if they remain flexible on the wording and the legality of the situation, I'm sure that something agreeable could be worked out, something workable could be worked out between the two countries or between the EU and Britain. But yes, it definitely makes a very, very tough situation for Boris Johnson. Maybe he will make a decision after the by-election, because if he loses majority, then that puts him in basically behind the 8 ball. And I think if that happens, he probably will go right ahead and call a snap election. Anyway, I've got a couple of articles here, so let's just flip over to them, and I'll just come back and do a quick wrap-up. Okie dokie, here we go. BBC News, Boris Johnson, is snap election just a contingency or plan A? Only 3 days into his premiership, and Boris Johnson has a lot to reflect on. He's reckless, he flies by the seat of his pants, he's a circus act. That's the view not only of the Labour opposition, but of a Conservative who worked closely with Boris Johnson, former Foreign Office Minister Sir Alan Duncan. But the new Prime Minister is not reckless enough to discount an early election as a possibility, and he may of course comfort himself with the fact that circus acts can be quite popular. Mr Johnson inherits, to all intents and purposes, no working majority at all. With the help of the Democratic Unionists, he has a majority of 2, and this will possibly halve by the end of next week if his party loses the Brecon and Radnorshire by-election. He hasn't endeared himself to those ministers he massacred in this week's reshuffle reboot, and already has about 15 to 20 Remainers or anti-no dealers on his benches who may be prepared to rebel against him. An election of choice. Will it take an election for Boris Johnson to prove the Brexit gloomsters wrong? The official government line is that its full weight is being put behind the effort to deliver Brexit by 31st of October. And that, after a series of elections and referendums in recent years, the public would rather get Brexit done than see a return to the ballot box. Indeed, Mr Johnson himself has suggested there will be no election until after Brexit is delivered. So, of course, it's not certain that he will call an election, but equally the evidence before our own eyes shouldn't be dismissed. Here is the thinking. The EU won't compromise on the backstop or do a series of mini deals on citizens' rights, mutual recognition of standards and so on. And then the doomsters and gloomsters, as Mr Johnson likes to call them, in Parliament somehow block no deal or mandate him to go to Brussels to ask for a Brexit extension. Mr Johnson has his casus belli, defeatist Remainers at home, bossy bureaucrats in Brussels, all trying to frustrate the will of the people and deny the result of the referendum. Rather than being outmanoeuvred in a confidence vote, why not simply have the confidence to go on the front foot and call an election? And just a little sidebar here from the Express, Boris told he can legally pull UK out of the EU on October 31st despite Remain election plot. Boris Johnson can legally pull the UK out of the EU on October the 31st even if he loses a vote of no confidence and his new government collapses, Brexiteer Attorney General Geoffrey Cox said. Brexit bulldog Mr Cox said there is no legal basis that would restrict new Prime Minister Mr Johnson from enforcing Brexit even if the UK was in the midst of a general election. Despite Mr Johnson on Friday insisting that he had no plans to call a snap election, he could still face a vote of no confidence when the summer recess is over and Parliament resumes in September. Those senior figures believe Mr Johnson is legally entitled to disregard tradition should a 7-week general election clash with the Halloween Brexit deadline. The third after former leader Theresa May begged the EU for a delay twice. And here we are, Brexit Party lashes out at Boris Johnson for tiptoeing route trailblazed by Nigel Farage. Brexit Party's chairman Richard Tice lashed out at Boris Johnson, accusing his government of imitating policies already outlined by Nigel Farage and not having ideas of their own. Mr Farage's right-hand man launched a scathing attack at Mr Johnson 4 days into his mandate. Mr Tice, a former Conservative MP, said Mr Johnson so far has only been tiptoed along the route already trailblazed by Mr Farage. Mr Johnson announced today during a visit to Manchester he wants to turbocharge the economy and boost the northern powerhouse. But Mr. Tice believes it is now time for the newly appointed Prime Minister to turn his pledges into action. He said ever since he has moved into number 10, Boris Johnson has been raiding the Brexit party cupboard wholesale. Though they say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, it just isn't enough. There is more to changing politics than touring the North and the Midlands and promising a few headline infrastructure projects. If we really mean it, we must completely refocus government to ensure that those areas that have been ignored for decades are given the opportunity that London has taken for granted. Now, there is absolutely no doubt that Boris Johnson is well known and well liked. He's a colourful character, and he is a very good orator. And I think there's a pretty even chance that he can raise the support of the whole country. And I think probably if anyone can see this through at this particular moment, it probably is Boris Johnson. The bits and pieces that I've read about his growing up, going to Oxford and this kind of stuff, was that he was really well liked by everybody. He was very often an intermediary because he could talk to both sides of opposite parties and bring them together into some kind of agreement. So this could be actually the very thing that the Conservative Party needed, and hopefully it's the thing that Brexit needs to leave on October the 31st and get this deal done. And actually, I think even if there was a second referendum, if that were to happen on the off chance, I think you'd find that Britons are so angry right now at the present situation that you might even find an even larger number of people voting to exit the EU, and especially now seeing how the EU behaved and how they feel like they should have a stranglehold on Britain. The EU has really shown its hand to everybody because this whole process has been so well documented, and of course some of the key players like Bernier and Verhofstadt have come out with some outrageous insults against Britain and Britons, saying that they are backward thinkers. Again, it's always the same insults. Knuckle draggers, racists, don't want to think ahead into a progressive future, so on and so forth, leave the protection of the EU, lose jobs, there's going to be a financial crash, there's going to be economic ruin. We've had 3 years of sitting on the fence and there has not been economic ruin. So I think this is a pretty good indication that that's the way it's going to continue. And as I said before, and I will say again, every buyer is looking for a seller and every seller is looking for a buyer. Okay, well, if you've enjoyed this video, please comment, like and subscribe below. And in the meantime, this is Hound Dog Steve signing off, wishing you a very pleasant evening and a pleasant weekend. And we will talk very, very shortly. See you now. Take care. Bye.